Hey guys, another deep dive today. We're going to be delving into macros. So if you've heard that word buzzing around, which I'm sure you have if you are following like any kind of nutrition, health, weight loss, any kind of things like that on social media, you probably would have heard this somewhere. But maybe you don't really know what it means. What does it mean for you? Do you need to worry about it? So that's what I'm going to do the deep dive on today. I forgot to say last week that if you've got any questions like about what I'm talking about, pop them in the comments and I can they're flashing up on the screen so I can answer them during the live. Yeah, I forgot to say that last week, and then after the live went back and answered loads of questions, and then I could have just done that in the video. So yeah, so macros, what are they? It's probably a good place to start. We hear this word all the time, but what does it mean? Macros is short for macronutrients. So there are three main ones. We've got protein, carbs, carbohydrates, and fats. So you can kind of think of it like is the next step from calorie tracking. So if you were if we think about this as like your money, I always like to tie this into money because it's a really good analogy. It works really well. You might know that you're getting a certain amount in every month, and every month you're spending this much, and that could be like your calorie counting, you're tracking your calories. But if you were to go that little bit further and look at, okay, so I get this amount in every month and I spend this much on shopping, this much on bills, this much on eating in restaurants, this much on clothes, you're just breaking it down into those smaller segments, and that's kind of what like macro tracking is all about. So yeah, those three macros, protein, carbs and fat, they're all vital. That's the first thing I want to say. You need all three of them. And we can talk about like the balance and where those things are going to come from, but either way, they all play different roles in the body. So you need to have all of them at some point throughout the day. So really the reason that I think most people are concerned about macros is they're always asking, what's the ideal split? So what they mean by that is like what percentage should I have of protein or carbs or fat? So again, coming back to the money analogy, how much of my budget should I be spending on food shopping? How much of my budget should I be spending on carbohydrates or proteins and things like that? And you won't be surprised by the answer that it is different for everyone. Good news. Because wouldn't it be so nice if I could just say to you, here's the magic formula, eat this amount of protein, carbs and fat, and boom, you'll be exactly where you want. But of course it doesn't really work like that. It's different for everyone. So all the factors that come into play to decide like how much of each of those you want or you need will be like your body composition. So how much muscle, how much lean tissue, how much fat have you got in your body? The activities you're doing. So are you pretty like sedentary? Are you really, really active? What sort of workouts are you doing? Your lifestyle. So like literally what foods do you like to eat? Because there's no point me saying to you, oh, you must eat however many grams of carbohydrates, but you don't even really like them and you'd much rather eat fats. And also your digestive system comes into play. So everyone digests, we'll come into it a little bit more later, but everyone digests and absorbs all the macronutrients slightly differently. So you'll just find that you work better on like a certain amount, like a certain split better than others. So yeah, there is a broad, like a generalisation, a scope that we can work with though. If you are like looking to increase or maintain your muscle mass, which I definitely would like that, I would promote that, especially for women, we need as much of that muscle mass as possible. You want to go for high protein. If you're not eating enough protein, then your muscle mass is going to decrease, and we don't want that. We talked last week about how muscle is active at rest. It's burning calories by doing nothing. If you are doing like high intensity workouts, CrossFit, HIIT training, interval work, Tabatas, stuff like that, you're probably going to want a little bit higher carb because you're going to need those like fuel sources. Then they're pretty quick, like we were talking about last week. You can convert carbs really quickly into energy for those muscles. If you're doing more like long distance endurance-y type stuff, like cycling, marathon training, that sort of thing, you could probably afford to go a little bit higher fat because your body doesn't need to convert the stores like as quickly. It doesn't need them right now for this high intensity stuff. That's pretty low intensity, long, slow distance type stuff. Then your body's got time to convert fat into energy for you. So you could go a little bit higher fat on that if you wanted to. Again, really depends on like your preferences. So just before we move on to talking about that in a little bit more detail and how you can find your like balance or split of those 3 macros, I just want to bring up this really important point, which is accuracy. So we can talk all day about, you should eat 120 grams of protein and 200 grams of carbs and 50 grams of fat, but how accurate is that going to be? And this is the one place where it actually doesn't really, there's not really an analogy to money, because it just isn't as accurate as that. So it might surprise you to know, it might not, because you might be a little bit cynical anyway, but it might surprise you to know that food manufacturers have like a margin of error on their labelling, and this can be up to about 20%. So on that food that you're eating, when it says, oh, it's 400 calories, it might not actually be 400 calories. It could be 20% over or under that. So there's our one problem that we've got with weighing and measuring food. The next is that, say that the food labelling is spot on, is completely accurate, is exactly 400 calories, and we know that there's 20 grams of protein in it, and we've got all of those numbers exactly right. That doesn't mean that your body is going to use that 20 grams of protein or 50 grams of carbs or whatever it is in exactly the same way as the next person, because your body digests and absorbs them very slightly differently to everybody else. You might not actually make the use of all of that. So we've got 2 issues there with accuracy, really. I mean, then we come to how accurate are scales. I mean, that's the other thing as well. So there's a lot of factors at play here where we can't actually count every penny like we could with a bank account. It doesn't really work like that with food. So we don't really need to get too hung up on all of the numbers. We can just measure with our hands and it will be a guess and it will be close enough. So if you are wondering about how much of each of these things to eat, there are tons of free calculators on the internet. Literally loads. MyFitnessPal will do it for you if you use that. You can just type in macro calculator on Google and I promise you'll get pages and pages worth. The other trouble with this, and again it comes to accuracy, is these like recommendations are going to be based on averages. So it's an average population, an average amount of lean tissue, and we'll come to why that's important in a minute, an average amount of body fat, an average amount of exercise or activity. And then, coming on to that, how accurate is your measure of activity in the day? And how accurate is your calorie burn or the level, like the intensity of the exercise that you're doing? So you just really can't get too hung up on it. There just isn't any point in worrying about the last gram, like, oh no, I've only got 89 grams of chicken and I needed 90. Even if you had 80 and you needed 90, it really isn't going to make that much bit of a difference. So don't stress about it. As everything with food, we can boil it down into these tiny little things, and scientists are, they're so interested in finding stuff out that they're trying to isolate things and work on this one thing. But actually, in general society, in food, we don't need to worry about it that much. So, oh, and here's another thing, just a little food for thought. Do we think cavemen had scales? Do we think cavemen were weighing out their grams of chicken that they managed to catch? Probably not. And those people were pretty fit. They were pretty fit and healthy. So, based on all of that, we know that it's not particularly accurate. There's no point getting hung up on it. We don't necessarily need to get the scales out. There is I think there is a learning curve to come from weighing and measuring your food. I think it can be really eye-opening for some people, and just having an idea, if you did it for like a week and then you knew, this amount of rice is 50 grams of carbs, say, that's a really good measure, a good tool that you can use later. Do we want to do that for life? Probably not. It's probably quite boring. Anyway, so how are we going to find like a split that works for you? So the first thing that I want to point out is lots of people will work in percentages, which I personally don't really like. So, and the reason this is, your body needs a certain amount of protein based on the amount of lean tissue that you've got. So lean tissue is basically everything that's not fat. If it's not body fat, it's lean tissue, and especially like muscle mass. So you need a certain amount of protein to keep that alive and to run all those other processes in your body that require it. Now, so let's say, just for, you know, argument's sake, let's say that number is 100 grams, just because that's easy to work with. If you are working in percentages and at 1200 calories, not that I would ever, condone anyone going to 1200 calories, but whatever, that's the number I've said for some reason. If you're at 1200 calories, you're eating 100 grams of protein, okay, and that's like a certain percentage, and then you drop your calories to 1000, well, now the amount of protein has gone down because your percentage is still the same, but now you're only eating like 80 or 90 grams. I probably should have done the math before this. But anyway, the point is, because it's proportional, the amount of protein's gone down, but actually the amount of lean tissue that you've got has not changed. The amount of fat that you might have changed, but protein doesn't depend on fat anyway. It only depends on lean tissue. And that, hopefully, because we want to maintain that muscle mass, should have stayed the same. So we don't want to decrease the protein intake. That needs to stay the same. So we don't want to work in percentages for that. Anyway, how much do you want? How much of protein do you need to eat? So for me, roughly, I like to say that people should have about a palm-sized portion per 10 kilos. So 10 kilos of your body weight, you need about a palm size. Now, again, this is going to change for different people, because if you have quite a lot of body fat, then actually maybe we need to work that number off of lean tissue amount. If you are particularly like low in body fat, then we might need to up that a little bit. We might need to change it. But generally, for the average person, and again, we're working in averages, which is why this stuff doesn't need to be measured to the gram, 1 palm size per 10 kilos of body weight. And then from there, whatever you do with the remainder of your calories, it doesn't really matter. As we said earlier, if you're like high intensity, doing loads of exercise, you're really, really active and you need to be go, 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 you probably want to eat a little bit higher carb. If you're not, if you're pretty sedentary, or if you're doing long distance stuff, you could eat a little bit higher fat. But as long as you've got that amount of protein, whatever you do with the remaining calories, so say 500 of your 2000 calories comes from protein, what you do with the remaining 1500 calories doesn't really matter. You could go half and half fat and carbs, you could go really high carb, really low fat, really high fat, whatever. Whatever you prefer to eat, whatever suits you better, whatever makes you, gives you good digestion, makes you feel good, all that sort of stuff, it doesn't actually really matter too much from there. And it also doesn't matter not just on a long term, but day to day. So you could eat really high fat on a Saturday, and on a Sunday eat really high carb. Doesn't really matter. Or just have a balance all the time. Whatever you want to do. So rounding up then, we said that we want about 1 palm size of protein per 10 kilos of body weight. If you're looking for then like a pretty balanced diet, I would say, and I said this last week in our carb deep dive, you want about a cupped handful, 1 or 2 of those of carbs per meal, not including veg, 1 or 2 of those per meal for the average person. 1 or 2 fists amount of veggies per meal, and then 1 or 2 thumb-sized portions of fat. So that might be like that amount of olive oil, or you have, a few nuts to equal your thumbs. And again, you could just adjust that. So if you are eating 1 or 2 cupped handfuls of carbs for every meal, and then not really feeling very great, feeling like you're lacking in energy, you could just switch it up a little bit. So stick with that for a while and then just monitor how it goes for you. If you are dropping weight rapidly and that's not either your goal, or you're losing too much weight too quickly, because that can be a problem, chuck in a little bit of extra carb and fat. If you are gaining weight or you're maintaining, your goal is to lose, then you can take a little bit out. Take a thumb of fat out. Take a cupped handful of carbs out. Just play with it. It doesn't have to be get your scales out and then measure everything to the gram. Just play around with it. Be easy with it. Don't stress too much about your food. That's my summary. So I hope that cleared up some of the questions about carbs, not carbs, macros. We did talk about carbs, but about macros and whether you really need to worry about it. My summary would be worry about your protein. And I'm pretty sure it's next week that I'm going to be doing a deep dive on protein. And you can imagine from the amount that I talk about it, that that's going to be pretty intense and full on. So I'll have loads to say about that. And if you can worry about that and get that in, then the other stuff will just happen and it will come and we can worry about it if we need to. But focus on that one macro would be my thing to end on. So yeah, if you have any questions, if you watch it at a later date, chuck them in the comments box and I'll reply to them later. And if not, I will see you next week for a talk all about protein. Goodbye.